Thanks, Hannah, for that. Another really interesting talk and something that's really important. And it really nicely rounds off the three papers we've had today, looking across the community work, the more technical stuff in North Africa and in the Middle East, and then having the conversations. We have overrun slightly, so we're going to still do the Q&A session, but we'll run slightly into lunch. Won't run too long into lunch, so don't worry. And we have had a few questions, but if you have any questions, still don't be afraid to pop them in the box and we'll see what we can do. So I'll start with, I think I noticed there's a few for Oliver, but I think your colleague Lawrence has been active in answering some of those, so that helps us out a bit. But there's one from Louise Barker for you, Oliver, I think. She wonders how and where will the information gathered be archived for future generations?
Well, I mean, in terms of the project and the findings that we have, the way we wanted to disseminate that was through a story mapper, an ArcGIS story mapper, which we thought was a great vehicle to do that because it combines all of the sort of visual imagery and the oral history data in one kind of place. So that's where we had in mind really as a kind of storage for this project. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I mean, we have all of the oral histories they're all archived on SoundCloud as well. So we have an account for that we would keep live through the length of the project, and hopefully, if we were to expand the project and get some more funding to develop it a bit more, we'd look more into her sort of longer term archiving of everything. But for the pilot project, it's really going to be disseminated as a report and online.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, it's always difficult. There's always a difficult archive question somewhere, and always hard to answer. So thank you. Moving on to a question for, I think it was for Kieran from Paul Jeffrey. He asked, my question is, how do you see partners using this change data in specific site management, and how use already been made in mitigation or recording prior to loss?
That's a difficult question because we haven't actually got to that stage yet. Literally what I presented was finished off a couple of weeks ago, pretty much when the talk was recorded just beforehand. So we haven't really had a chance to engage with our partners and see how they want to engage with it. We're going to give them the information. We're going to say this is what we think in terms of the future of these sites will be. And then we're going to try and have a discussion with them about how they could then go about using it to prioritize action and so forth. But at the moment, there isn't a definite concrete plan as to what we will do. So it's a bit of a trial run in some respects. So sorry, I don't have any more. Yeah, a hard and fast answer on that.
Well, thanks, Kieran. I'll just follow that with my own question to you, Kieran. I was wondering, obviously, you're operating across a whole sort of collection of countries there, which in a way is similar to the UK, I guess, in Wales, Scotland, England, and Ireland. So I was wondering, in terms of the data sets, was there a lot of difference between the stuff you're using, or was it quite sort of similar in what you're able to get and use?
Purely from a kind of remote sensing perspective, or the archaeological ones? From a remote sensing perspective, it's the same, basically. We have access to, we have so much information at our fingertips in terms of open access satellite imagery. That's the same across large areas. For things like the spy satellite imagery, that will vary. Some countries will have more than others for various geopolitical reasons and, simple environmental things like cloud cover. From the archaeology side, that's one of the reasons why we're trying to go through and put together this database, is so we do have a more uniform data set to work with. And there is, you could describe as unevenness in the data, because some areas have much more published information about them than others, for example. So that does lead into that kind of, some areas will be better covered than others, and some we will have very little information on, but we'll try and put what we can observe from the satellite imagery into the database. And hopefully once it's all kind of, structured in the same way, you can then enable these comparisons across large areas.
Okay, thank you. Okay, over to Hannah. I don't think there was any questions from the audience, but just one from myself in terms of looking at different perceptions of the coast. I was wondering if you see any sort of differences in how people around England perceive their coast, because obviously you have different heritage sites, different amounts of erosion, geologies, and that sort of thing. So I was wondering if you see any difference in how people perceive their loss at the coast.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the two different aspects of that, one is the relationship that people have with the coast, which I think really does vary depending on how active an industry there is, how many people are actually working, the relationship between the local economy and the coastline, and how that has changed. So some parts of the coast, I think there's very close connection, but as somewhere you go on holiday, leisure. Others, there may be, it's how you earn your living, and it's a much more functional one. But I think that that plays into then that relationship with loss. And I think, again, another aspect that's coming out of some of the research that Tanya and others have done is how the different sorts of communities, so those who vacation regularly at a particular site may perceive changes and loss in one way. Others, if you live in an area day in, day out, the idea of living with that constant change, that loss becomes less obvious or less dramatic. So I think there are differences. I'm not sure that you could definitely pick up on any particular patterns and say this corner of England responds in this way. And I think that's part of the point of some of the things that Tanya's in particular finding, that multiplicity in approaches, not making the assumption that you can categorise things in particular places.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. Yeah, obviously about the in Wales especially, we do a lot of work in Pembrokeshire about the whole holidaying. The stories you get are mostly from people holiday to these sites, and obviously they have a totally different view of it, because they might only visit a place once a year, and they might see substantial change in that period, as opposed to more gradual change that I guess kind of sneaks up on people maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, if your caravan is being moved because the coast has changed and you used to have a sea view and now you're at the back of the pitch, then that will affect how you see it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's really interesting. It's something that I'm really interested in. Okay, I think one more question. Do we have any? Who's this one to? How do you think archaeologists should approach the recording community memories, perspectives, and values, rather different data to the things we usually record? So I guess that's one for Oliver. I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, sorry, could you just repeat the question, Dan?
Yeah, sorry. How do you think archaeologists should approach the recording of community memories, perspectives, and values?
Ooh. Thank you for that one. I can only speak from the experience of the project that we've done and the way that we captured the data that we did. And by and large, people are generally extremely keen to talk about their local community and their heritage, and for the case that we were involved in, the changes that have taken place. So I think it's just kind of with an ear to letting them lead the conversation in many respects. Because like Hannah was saying, lots of different aspects of the coast mean a lot of different things to different people. And it's allowing them to kind of capture that data within a framework, which is why we selected not a hugely wide, but a fairly varied set of 6 kind of categories to gather information to talk to people about, and they can they slotted themselves into those categories kind of without too much prompting, and they were able to talk about those different elements. I mean, it was quite a learning process for us trying to tease out some information, because in the past it's just been general conversations purely about heritage. But what we found was that if you take a different angle to that, so you look at the industries, so the oyster industry and the fishing industry and things like that, you will come back to questions of heritage, or the speaker will naturally drop onto certain monuments or features or things that are within their working area. So I suppose it's just offering those different doorways in for people, really.
Okay, thank you. Okay, one more question, then we'll round off the session. I think this one's for you, Hannah. Erin Roberts says, thanks for another great presentation. I was wondering about how you're thinking about different temporal scales of change, sudden versus gradual, daily, seasonal, annual, and longer timescales, and how that features into developing a language of loss and might even be valued.
Yeah, that's another very good point. I think it's one of the things that Tanya's certainly been grappling with in her research. It's a shame she's not here to answer that one herself. Maybe track her down on Twitter for it. But I think one of the challenges is where you know that there is change that will be inevitable, but you don't know exactly when, sort of anticipating that, versus the sorts of change and challenges, which I think are that we're getting our head around the fact that lumps of cliffs fall off. With hindsight, we go, oh yeah, we sort of expected that to happen. But there will be other situations where we're very good at burying our heads in the sand and kicking things down the kind of, oh, well, we're not sure we need to do anything about that yet. We'll wait till something happens. And it's thinking about those tipping points. And everything that we are doing, both in the Landscape Futures project and Tanya's research and everything else, is pointing to the fact that the point at which you think you need to think about it and talk to people about it is probably too late. You probably should have done it much sooner. So I think in some ways the timeframes matter less than the starting the conversations and really recognizing you don't have all the answers. We're never going to know exactly when these things are going to happen. We can't control them, and that's that loss of control, that loss of certainty, and navigating that uncertainty is, I think, why it feels quite challenging, and why it's so important to just start the conversation. So I think the language is more about how you almost don't engage in trying to pin down timeframes, which sounds really odd for archaeologists. That's what we do, and how you can navigate that without making that the kind of driving force of, okay, so when is that going to happen? That if we focus too much on that, we miss some of those conversations. I think, as Oliver was just saying, that allowing people to talk through what might happen. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, just to follow that up, if that's all right, I think I'm just talking about the potential for this loss. I think the work that we did, what it really highlighted is that even though change is quite a creeping process throughout someone's lifetime who lives by the coast, when you put that together and you bring those images and those maps together, it becomes extremely stark for them. And that's something that they all realize, these very different foreshore environments that have changed throughout their lifetime. It was not immediately obvious to them just how stark that change was, and seeing that within their life as a generational thing, I think that has a little more weight to show to younger people that live on the island. This has surprised a generation that has lived through a relatively calm period of change in some ways. So looking to the future, it's kind of just, it can happen within your lifetime, and so be aware that change is coming and try to capture what you can before it goes.
And that relationship with the coast, I think I talk about that particular thing of access. So what we value about these places is often that ability to access and use and engage with the coast. So if that's what's really important, and if that is something that is likely to change, how can you focus on trying to conserve that aspect of the less tangible heritage, as well as capturing the information that we will be losing? And I think that the sorts of decisions you need to make in order to conserve that are probably earlier than when you've lost that access and you're trying to construct something that enables that.
Well, thanks all for that. It's really great discussion and really nice way to round off this session. Really great stuff. Sorry we overrun a bit, but I think it was worth it for that discussion. Brilliant. So yeah, thank you, Oliver, Kieran, and Hannah, for your papers and your input today. Really great. And so yeah, that's the end of the session. We start again at 2:00. So we either see you here in the Dinner Clear Room or Dunbeg. So yeah, enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you in